Hi everyone, I'm Francesca and today I'll be teaching you about square root functions. So today what we'll learn is how to graph it, what is domain and range, how to get them, and the transformations in the graph. So first, what is a square root function? A square root function is the inverse function of a parabola. The parent function of a parabola is y equals x squared, and the parent function of a square root is f of x equals the square root of x. This one is the parent graph of the function, and the domain is every number that's equal to or greater than 0, and range is every number that's equal to or greater than 0. Remember that every number inside the square root has to be positive for the function to work. So, what is the domain? The domain is the set of all possible x values that would make the function work. As you can see in this graph, the domain of this function or this line is a to b. Next is the range. The range is the set of all possible y values that would make the function work. In this example, the dataset is from 3 to 6, which means that they're 3 units away. That's why the range is 3. So, transformations. Transformations is when a function is reflected, rotated, or translated in a graph. This is the reflection, the rotation, and the translation. We will learn how to make the parent function translate, rotate, and reflect depending on the equation that is given. So now we're gonna apply it to the square root functions. The first example is f of x equals the square root of 6 minus 3x. So the first step we want to do with this equation is change the order. That way the x is first, and that would make easier the second step, which is complete the square. Once we've done that and we have the equation f of x equals the square root of 3x minus 6, we can continue with completing the square. This would take us to f of x equals the square root of negative 3 parentheses x minus 2 close parentheses. Now what we have to do is identify the transformations. So for identifying the transformations, you have to remember the transformation rules. So first, you have to make sure you stretch, shrink, or reflect before you slide, up, down, left, or right. And remember that everything that's inside is going to be the opposite, and everything that's outside is going to be just how it is. If the factor is multiplied by the x or y, it is going to be a shrink or a stretch. If there's a negative that is being multiplied by the x or the y, it's going to be a reflection. And if it's a factor that is being added or subtracted to the x or the y, it's going to be a translation to the left, right, up, or down. Okay, so now that we have refreshed the rules, we're going to identify the transformations in this equation. F of x equals square root of negative 3 parentheses x minus 2. So, the negative 3 inside the square root represents a horizontal shrink by a factor of 1/3 because the 3 it's inside the square root. That means that it's going to be the opposite. The negative 2 inside the parentheses, this one, it represents the translation of the origin 2 points to the right. That's because it's also inside, so that means that it's the opposite. And that instead of going to the left, it goes to the right. The reflection over the y-axis, it's gonna be thanks to this negative symbol before the 3. That makes the whole graph reflect over the y-axis. The domain of this equation is every number that's equal to or less than 2, and the range is every number that's equal to or more than 0. You'll see it in the next graph. Okay, so how are we going to graph this equation? First, we'll have the parent function, which is this one, and the points of the parent function. So, once we have identified the translations, we're gonna apply them to x and y. Since we know there is a horizontal shrink by a factor of 1/3, we're gonna put it next to the x. That way, the x is affected, not the y. The same goes for the 2. Since it goes 2 to the right, we're gonna put +2 with the x. And we can't forget about the reflection, because that changes the whole graph. So here is the negative symbol. The y, in this case, stays the same, but this doesn't happen in every square root function. So now, the next step is to take the points of the parent function and apply this to them. So these are the final answers. For example, in the point 0, 0, once you've multiplied it and added it, and the y stays the same, the final point is -2, 0. Once you've done that with the whole points, you'll get the answers. And these points are the ones you're gonna want to graph. Once you graph it, you can clearly see the reflection, the translation, and the stretch and shrink. The next step is to graph. So once we've graphed the points, we'll get this line. This one is the blue one is the parent function. The red one is the modified function. So now the domain is every number that's equal to or less than -2. And the range is every number that's equal to or greater than 0. That's because the domain is the x and the range is the y. Now for the next example. This one is the given function. F of x equals 2 square root of negative x plus 3 plus 1. So what we want to do first is identify the transformations. So the negative outside the parentheses represents a reflection over the y-axis. This one. The 2 outside the square root represents a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. Remember that since it is outside, it stays the same, it's not the opposite. The +3 inside the parentheses represents that the function will move 3 units to the left. This one. And the +1 outside means that the whole function will move 1 unit up. This one. Okay, so now we'll do the same thing we did before, which is apply it to the x and y so we could get the points. This one is the original and these are the original points. So, since we know that there is a reflection over the y-axis, the negative is gonna go with the x. And since we know that the whole function moves 3 units to the left, it's gonna be -3. In this case, the y is affected because there is a vertical stretch by a factor of 2. That's why there's a 2 multiplied by the 1, and that the whole unit, the whole graph goes up 1 unit, which is why there's a +1 here. So now we'll take the original points and apply this to them. That way we'll get the points in which the graph is already translated. For instance, if we have 0, 0 and we apply this, we'll get -3, 1. That's because 0 multiplied by negative is 0, but -3 is -3. And 0 multiplied by 2 is 0, but +1 is 1. So this is what we get. And once we have all the points figured out, we can graph it. And this will be the answer. This one, the blue line, is the parent function. And the red line is the modified function. So once we graph the points, we have the line. Now, the domain of this equation is every number that's equal to or less than -3. And the range is every number that's equal to or greater than 1. Remember, the domain is the x values that would make the function work. So this is why all the numbers that are less than -3 will work. And the range is the y values that would make the function work. And it starts at 1 because the function starts at 1, not at 0. So those were 2 examples of the square root functions and their translations, how to graph them, and how to get domain and range. I hope this is useful for you and that you enjoyed my video. Bye!